The scream that pierced the African night 6.4 million years ago would echo through eternity. In the suffocating darkness of a limestone cave, where shadows danced like demons on ancient walls, a female Homo habilis stood between death and everything she loved. Her knuckles bled as they gripped a jagged stone. Behind her, three small forms whimpered in terror. Ahead, yellow eyes gleamed with predatory hunger. The cave wolves had found them. Tonight, evolution would write its most brutal lesson in blood and bone. What happened in those horrifying moments would determine whether humanity's earliest ancestors would see another dawn, or become just another fossil buried in time's merciless grave. The storm had been raging for 3 days, turning the African savanna into a nightmare of mud and fury. Lightning split the obsidian sky like divine claws, illuminating a world that seemed determined to swallow every living thing whole. She crouched at the cave entrance, her name lost to history, but her courage about to echo through millions of years. This female Homo habilis, no taller than a modern child, but with the fierce determination of a mother protecting her young, watched the rain cascade down like tears from an angry god. KRES dot 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 ES H dot 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 double, she whispered, the primitive sounds that served as language among her kind. Behind her, three juveniles huddled together, her offspring and the child of her deceased sister. Their large eyes reflected the intermittent flashes of lightning, wide with primal fear. The cave had seemed like salvation when they'd found it that morning, deep enough to shelter them from the relentless storm, high enough above the flooding plains to keep them safe from the rising waters. But caves in this harsh world were never truly empty. They were borrowed spaces, temporary refuges that always demanded payment in blood. She sniffed the air, her nostrils flaring. Something was wrong. The musty scent of wet limestone mixed with another odor, something foul, predatory, and growing stronger by the minute. Her primitive brain, still developing the neural pathways that would one day create human civilization, screamed warnings in languages not yet invented. A sound echoed from the depths of the cave. Not the drip of water or the whistle of wind through stone passages. Something else. Something that made the hair on her neck stand rigid with terror. Rag, RGH. The breathing was deep, rhythmic, and definitely not human. The female's hand closed around a sharp piece of flint. Her knuckles whitened as she gripped it so tightly that blood began to seep between her fingers. The pain was nothing compared to the ice-cold realization spreading through her chest. They were not alone. From the blackness behind them came the soft pad of paws on stone. Multiple sets of paws. The rhythmic panting grew louder, accompanied by the subtle scrape of claws against rock. Her offspring pressed closer to her back, their small bodies trembling with an instinctual understanding of mortal danger. The first pair of eyes appeared in the darkness, yellow, unblinking, filled with an ancient hunger that had stalked these lands for millennia. Then another pair, and another. Cave wolves, the apex predators of their world, perfectly adapted to hunt in the suffocating darkness of underground layers. Their muscular bodies, larger than their modern descendants, moved with liquid grace through the shadows. Their fangs, yellowed with age and stained with the blood of countless kills, gleamed in the occasional lightning flash. The alpha male emerged first, his massive frame filling the narrow passage. His coat was a mottled gray-black, scarred from battles with competitors and prey alike. Behind him, three more wolves materialized from the darkness like nightmares given form. The female's mind raced with the limited tactical thinking her species possessed. The cave entrance was behind her, but the storm raged with such violence that leaving meant certain death in the flooded plains below. The wolves blocked the only other exit deeper into the cave system. She was trapped. The alpha wolf's lips peeled back in a silent snarl, revealing teeth designed by evolution to crush bone and tear flesh. His pack flanked him, Their synchronized movements speaking to an intelligence that had allowed them to dominate these caverns for generations. But as the female stared into those pitiless yellow eyes, something stirred within her primitive consciousness. Something that her distant descendants would call courage, though she had no word for it. Something that would separate her lineage from the countless species that had already vanished into evolutionary oblivion. She would not run. She could not run. Behind her, one of the juveniles whimpered, a sound so small and vulnerable that it pierced through the thunder and rain. The alpha wolf's ears perked up at the sound, his head tilting slightly. To him, it was the dinner bell. But to her, it was everything worth dying for. The standoff stretched like a taut sinew ready to snap. Lightning illuminated the cave entrance in stroboscopic flashes, casting grotesque shadows that danced across the limestone walls like prehistoric cave paintings come to life. The female's breathing came in short, controlled bursts. Every muscle in her compact frame coiled like a spring, ready to unleash violence she had never imagined herself capable of. The sharp flint in her hand felt impossibly small against the predators before her, yet it was all that stood between her family and oblivion. The alpha wolf took a deliberate step forward, his massive paw making no sound on the cave floor. His pack moved in perfect synchronization, spreading out to cut off any possible escape route. These were unmindless beasts. They were calculated killers who had perfected their hunting techniques over thousands of years. GRAS.GRH. Doubly Giro throat. Not quite words, but loaded with meaning. It was a warning, a threat, a desperate attempt to communicate that she would not surrender without a fight. The alpha's response was a low growl that seemed to emanate from the very depths of hell itself. The sound reverberated through the cave, mixing with the thunder outside to create a symphony of approaching doom. Behind her, the juveniles pressed so close she could feel their rapid heartbeats against her back. Their small hands clutched at her rough hide clothing, seeking comfort that she wished she could provide. But comfort was a luxury that evolution had not yet invented. Survival was the only currency that mattered in this brutal world. The cave itself seemed to hold its breath. Water dripped steadily from stalactites, each drop marking time like a countdown to violence. The air was thick with tension, musty with the scent of ancient stone and the metallic tang of fierce sweat. Suddenly, one of the younger wolves broke formation. Hunger and impatience overrode pack discipline as it lunged forward, jaws gaping wide. The female moved with a speed that surprised even her. The flint in her hand arced through the air, catching the wolf across its snout in a spray of blood and saliva. The predator's yelp of pain and surprise echoed through the cavern as it stumbled backward, pawing at its injured face. But her small victory came at a cost. The sudden movement had left her off balance, and the alpha seized the opportunity. With a roar that made the cave walls tremble, he launched himself forward, his massive form blotting out what little light filtered in from the storm outside. Time slowed to a crawl. She could see every detail of the approaching death. The wolf's yellow fangs, each one the size of her thumb, the bunched muscles rippling beneath his scarred coat. The intelligence burning in those ancient eyes that promised a quick but agonizing end. Her primitive brain processed calculations with lightning speed. She could dodge to the left, but that would expose the juveniles. She could try to meet the attack head-on, but her small frame would be crushed in seconds. Every option led to the same horrifying conclusion, except one. Instead of dodging or retreating, she did something that defied every survival instinct screaming in her head. She stepped forward, directly into the path of the charging predator. The movement was so unexpected that even the alpha hesitated for a fraction of a second. That hesitation saved her life. Her second piece of flint, one she had concealed in her other hand, found its mark just below the wolf's ribcage. The sharp stone punched through fur and flesh, sinking deep into the soft tissue beneath. Hot blood splashed across her face and arms as the wolf's momentum carried him past her, his roar of rage turning into a howl of pain. The alpha crashed into the cave wall, his claws scrabbling for purchase on the slick limestone. Dark blood pooled beneath him, but even wounded, he was far from defeated. His yellow eyes now burned with something beyond hunger, a personal hatred that made him infinitely more dangerous. The remaining wolves circled closer, their pack tactics adjusting to this unexpected development. Their primitive minds couldn't comprehend how such a small creature had managed to wound their leader, but they could smell weakness in the blood that now flowed freely from their alpha's side. The female backed toward her juveniles, both pieces of flint now slick with wolf blood. Her hand shook, not from fear but from the adrenaline coursing through her primitive nervous system. She had drawn first blood, but the fight was far from over. Thunder crashed outside, so close that it seemed to shake the very foundations of the earth. In that moment of deafening sound, she made a decision that would ripple through evolutionary history. She would not merely defend. She would attack. The wounded alpha wolf's roar shattered the cave's oppressive silence, mixing with the thunder outside to create a sound like the world itself screaming. Blood dripped steadily from the gash beneath his ribs, each drop hitting the stone floor with a sound that echoed like a primitive drum beat. But pain had not weakened the massive predator. It had transformed him into something even more terrifying. His yellow eyes now burned with intelligence and fury, calculating not just how to kill, but how to make the killing last. He had been marked by prey, an unforgivable insult that demanded the most brutal retribution. The female could taste copper in the air, could smell the iron-rich scent of wolf blood mixing with the musty cave atmosphere. Her own blood, seeping from dozens of small cuts where the flint had bitten into her palms, added to the metallic symphony of violence. KRES.T.RESH.K. She whispered to the juveniles, the sounds carrying meanings that would be lost to time, but spoke of love and protection in humanity's most primitive language. One of the young ones, barely old enough to walk upright, reached out with a tiny hand to touch her leg. The gesture was so trusting, so vulnerable, that it ignited something primal in her chest. The pack had regrouped, their hunting formation now adapted to account for their leader's injury. The three remaining wolves spread out in a semicircle, their coordination speaking to an intelligence that rivaled her own. They had learned to respect the small creature with the sharp stones, but respect only made them more careful, not less deadly. The cave walls seemed to close in around them, the limestone formations casting twisted shadows that moved and writhed in the intermittent lightning flashes. Water continued to drip from the ceiling, each drop marking time in this underground arena where evolution itself would be decided. The alpha made his move first, but this time he was cunning. Instead of charging directly, he feinted to the left, drawing her attention while one of his packmates circled around to her blind side. The coordination was flawless, the result of countless successful hunts in these very caverns. She saw the trap closing but had no choice but to react. Her third piece of flint, scraped hastily from the cave wall while the pack regrouped, flew through the air toward the flanking wolf. It struck true, opening a red line across the predator's shoulder, but the wound was shallow. The wolf barely flinched. The distraction cost her precious seconds. The alpha was on her before she could recover, his massive paws slamming into her chest and driving her backward. She hit the cave wall hard enough to see stars, her breath driven from her lungs in a painful whoosh. But even as she fell, her hands found another weapon. The cave floor was littered with loose stones, fragments of limestone that had fallen from the ceiling over countless centuries. Her fingers closed around a rock the size of her fist, its surface sharp and unforgiving. The alpha's jaws gaped wide, revealing the pink interior of his mouth and the ivory daggers that would end her life. She could smell his breath, hot and rank with the scent of previous kills. Time compressed to a single heartbeat, a single moment where the future of human evolution hung in the balance. She drove the stone upward with every ounce of strength her small frame possessed. The rock caught the wolf just under his lower jaw, the sharp limestone edge opening his throat in a spray of arterial blood that painted the cave wall crimson. The alpha's eyes widened in shock, then fury, then something that might have been recognition. In those final seconds, as his life poured out onto the ancient stone, he seemed to understand that he was witnessing something new, something that would change the world. He collapsed beside her, his massive form twitching once before going still. The silence that followed was deafening, broken only by the steady drip of blood onto stone and the distant rumble of thunder. But the fight was not over. 3 wolves remained, and now they were driven by something beyond hunger. Their pack leader was dead, killed by a creature they had dismissed as helpless prey. The natural order had been violated, and nature demanded balance. The largest of the remaining wolves stepped forward, his coat a mottled brown that seemed to absorb what little light penetrated the cave. This was the alpha's brother, a scarred veteran of countless battles who had been content to follow until now. Leadership had been thrust upon him by violence, and he would claim it the same way. His howl filled the cave, a sound of grief and rage that seemed to come from the very depths of the earth. It was answered by his packmates, their voices joining in a chorus that spoke of death and vengeance. The female struggled to her feet, her back pressed against the cold limestone wall. Every muscle in her body screamed in protest. Every breath sent knives of pain through her chest. But she was still alive, still standing between her family and oblivion. She reached for another stone, but her blood-slick fingers couldn't find purchase on the smooth cave floor. The wolves advanced, their coordination perfect despite the loss of their leader. They had learned from their alpha's mistake. They would not underestimate her again. In that moment, as death approached on padded paws, she made a sound that had never before echoed in these ancient caverns. It wasn't the guttural warning calls of her species, nor the primitive vocalizations that barely qualified as language. It was something new, something that her descendants would recognize millions of years later as the first human scream of defiance. The scream that erupted from her throat was unlike anything that had echoed through those ancient caverns. It was primal and raw, but beneath the animal terror was something else, something that would distinguish her lineage from every other species that had walked the earth. It was the sound of conscious choice, the moment when survival instinct transformed into deliberate courage. The 3 remaining wolves paused, their primitive brains struggling to process this new sound. In their countless hunts, prey had always responded predictably, with flight, with submission, with the desperate thrashing of creatures accepting their fate. But this sound carried defiance, a quality that made them instinctively uneasy. The cave itself seemed to respond to her cry. Bats, disturbed from their roosts high in the limestone cathedral, burst from hidden crevices in a tornado of leather wings and piercing shrieks. Their chaotic flight created a maelstrom of confusion, breaking the wolves' formation and buying her precious seconds. But she needed more than seconds. She needed a miracle. Her eyes, adapted to the cave's darkness through generations of ancestors who had sheltered in similar refuges, caught something the wolves had missed. Near the back of the cave, where the passage narrowed to barely the width of her body, water had carved a channel through the limestone. The steady drip she had been hearing wasn't just from the ceiling. It was overflow from an underground stream. Where there was flowing water, there might be another exit. The juvenile behind her, the one who had touched her leg with such trust, made a soft, questioning sound. In that primitive vocalization, she heard something that transcended language, the absolute faith that she would protect them, no matter the cost. The new pack leader, the scarred wolf who had inherited leadership through violence, finally moved. His approach was different from his brother's, more cautious, more calculating. He had watched the alpha die and learned from those final moments. This small creature's weapons were limited, but in the confined space of the cave, even small weapons could prove lethal. His packmates flanked him, but their formation was looser now, more defensive. They had tasted blood and wanted more, but they also wanted to live to enjoy their victory. Fear had entered the equation, and fear made them dangerous in an entirely different way. The female began to back toward the narrow passage, her movements slow and deliberate. The juveniles followed, their small hands clutching at her hide garments, their eyes wide with terror but still trusting. They moved as one unit, a family bound together by bonds stronger than the stone around them. A chad. She growled, her voice hoarse from her earlier scream, but still carrying the promise of violence. In her right hand, she had found another piece of flint. In her left, she clutched a fragment of wolf tooth, broken off during her struggle with the alpha. Both weapons were slick with blood, hers and theirs. The wolves advanced in measured steps, their claws clicking softly on the stone floor. The sound was hypnotic, rhythmic, like the tick of some primitive claw counting down to doom. Lightning continued to flash outside, illuminating the cave entrance in brief, stark moments that revealed the carnage they had left behind. The alpha's body lay in a spreading pool of blood, his massive form reduced to nothing more than cooling meat. The sight should have filled her with triumph, but instead she felt only the weight of what was still to come. One victory meant nothing if it led to ultimate defeat. As they reached the narrow passage, she felt cool air on her face. The sensation was subtle but unmistakable. Wind moving through stone, carrying with it the scent of rain and open sky. There was another way out, but it would mean abandoning the relative safety of the main cave for the unknown dangers of the underground waterway. The new pack leader sensed her hesitation and pressed forward, his scarred muzzle pulling back to reveal fangs that had been honed by decades of killing. He was older than the alpha had been, more experienced, more patient. He would not make the same mistakes his brother had made. But he had not counted on the water. The underground stream, swollen by days of torrential rain, chose that moment to surge. What had been a gentle trickle became a rushing torrent as the limestone channel could no longer contain the flood of water pouring in from the storm-soaked surface. The narrow passage filled with churning muddy water that rose with terrifying speed. The female made her choice in that instant. She grabbed the nearest juvenile and dove into the rushing water, trusting that the others would follow. The current seized them immediately, dragging them through the narrow channel with bone-crushing force. Stones scraped against her skin, tearing away flesh and hide clothing alike, but the pain was nothing compared to the terror of drowning in absolute darkness. Behind them, the wolves' howls of frustration echoed through the flooding cave. They were too large to follow through the narrow passage, too heavy to ride the flood that swept their prey away. For the moment, the water was their salvation. But as the torrent carried them deeper into the heart of the earth, she realized they might have escaped one death only to find another. The channel twisted and turned, sometimes wide enough to breathe, sometimes so narrow that the water pressed them against the ceiling with crushing force. In the absolute darkness, she could only hold tight to the juvenile in her arms and pray to whatever gods watched over their primitive world. The sound of rushing water filled her ears, drowning out everything else. She couldn't tell if the other juveniles had made it into the channel, couldn't even tell if she and the one in her arms were still alive or had passed into whatever realm awaited the dead. All she could do was hold on and let the flood carry them toward an uncertain fate. The underground river had become a liquid nightmare, dragging them through a maze of limestone passages that had been carved over millions of years by patient water and time. In the absolute darkness, there was no way to tell up from down, no way to know if they were being carried toward salvation or deeper into the earth's stone heart. The juvenile in her arms had gone limp, whether from unconsciousness or death, she couldn't tell. Her own lungs burned with the desperate need for air. But every few seconds, the tunnel ceiling would drop low enough to force them underwater. Each submersion felt like drowning, each emergence like resurrection. Stone scraped against her skin with the grinding persistence of a predator's teeth. Her hide clothing had been torn away completely, leaving her exposed to the razor-sharp limestone that lined the passage. Blood from countless cuts mixed with the muddy water, creating a pink foam that swirled around them in the darkness. But even as her body was being systematically destroyed by the flood, her mind remained focused on one thing: the small life she held against her chest. The juvenile's heartbeat was barely detectable, a flutter so faint it might have been her imagination, but it was enough. As long as that heart beat, she would keep fighting. The sound of the water changed, its roar becoming deeper, more resonant. They were entering a larger chamber, she realized. Somewhere the underground river pooled before continuing its journey through the earth. The current slowed, allowing her to finally get her bearings and search for a way to the surface. Her hands found purchase on a submerged boulder, its surface worn smooth by countless years of flowing water. Using it as an anchor, she pulled herself and the juvenile toward what she hoped was the chamber's edge. The water was deep here, deeper than she could stand, but the current was weak enough that she could make progress against it. Her lungs were on fire, her vision beginning to blur from oxygen deprivation when her head finally broke the surface. The air she gasped was thin and stale, but it was air. She held the juvenile's face above the water and was rewarded with the sound of weak coughing. The child was alive. But they were not safe, not yet. The chamber was vast, its ceiling lost in absolute darkness. The sound of dripping water echoed from all directions, creating an acoustic maze that made it impossible to determine the room's true dimensions. Somewhere in that darkness were the other juveniles, assuming they had survived the flood. Care, is it .kr, is it . She called softly, her voice barely above a whisper. The sound seemed to be absorbed by the stone around them, swallowed by the immensity of the underground cathedral. For a moment, there was only the endless drip of water and her own labored breathing. Then, from somewhere across the dark pool, came an answering call, faint, frightened, but unmistakably alive. Relief flooded through her with such intensity that she nearly lost her grip on the boulder. They had made it, all of them. Against impossible odds, her family had survived the flood that should have killed them. But survival was only the first step. They were trapped in an underground chamber with no obvious way out, their bodies battered and bleeding, their strength nearly exhausted. The wolves might be gone, but the earth itself had become their prison. She began to work her way around the chamber's edge, feeling along the stone wall for any opening that might lead to the surface. The juvenile in her arms had regained enough strength to cling to her shoulders, freeing her hands to explore their rocky prison. The limestone was smooth here, polished by centuries of water action in the surfaces that felt almost organic. But smoothness meant no handholds, no way to climb toward whatever ceiling lay hidden in the darkness above. They were trapped as effectively as if they had been buried alive. It was then that she noticed the smell. Mixed with the mineral scent of limestone and the organic tang of underground water was something else. Something that made her primitive brain light up with sudden hope. Wood smoke. Somewhere above them, perhaps far above, someone had built a fire. The smoke was filtering down through cracks in the stone, carrying with it the promise of open sky and breathable air. Where there was smoke, there had to be a way out. She began to search more frantically, her hands exploring every crack and crevice in the chamber walls. The smoke scent was strongest near what felt like a collapse in the chamber's ceiling, where fallen stones had created a rough pile that might be climbable. The juvenile on her back made soft questioning sounds as she began to ascend the treacherous slope. Each stone was slick with water and unstable, threatening to send them both tumbling back into the pool below. But the smoke scent was getting stronger, and with it came something even more precious. The faintest whisper of air movement. There was a passage here, hidden among the fallen stones. It was narrow, barely wide enough for her body, that it angled upward toward the source of that life-giving smoke. If she could reach the others, if they could all fit through the passage, they might yet see the sun again. The climb seemed to take forever. Her muscles, already pushed beyond their limits by the night's ordeal, screamed in protest with every movement. The juvenile on her back grew heavier with each passing moment, their combined weight threatening to bring down the entire unstable pile of stones. But finally, impossibly, her head emerged into another chamber. This one was smaller, its ceiling low enough that she could almost touch it. And there, filtering through a crack barely wide enough for her arm, came blessed daylight. The storm had passed. Somewhere above, the sun was rising on a new day. The crack in the limestone ceiling was no wider than her forearm, but through it streamed the most beautiful light she had ever seen. Golden sunbeams, filtered through the African sky, painted impossible patterns on the chamber walls, and filled her primitive heart with a hope she had thought lost forever. The juvenile on her back stirred, making soft sounds of wonder at the miraculous illumination. After the absolute darkness of the underground river, even this filtered daylight seemed bright as the noon sun. But wonder was a luxury they couldn't afford, not yet. She could hear the others below, their calls echoing up from the flooded chamber. They had found the stone pile and were beginning to climb, their movements creating small avalanches that splashed into the dark water below. Every loose stone that fell brought the risk of collapse, of trapping them all in a tomb of their own making. But they climbed anyway, driven by the same desperate hope that had carried her up the treacherous slope. The two remaining juveniles, battered and exhausted, but alive, emerged into the upper chamber like creatures being born from the earth itself. Their large eyes, adapted for darkness, blinked rapidly in the sudden light. The crack in the ceiling was their salvation, but it was also their greatest challenge. The opening was just barely wide enough for their slender bodies, and beyond it lay an unknown distance to the surface. There was no way to know if the passage continued, or if it narrowed to nothing just out of sight. She studied the juvenile she had carried, the smallest of the three. Its breathing was steady now, its eyes alert despite the ordeal they had endured. The child would have to go first. It was small enough to navigate the passage easily and could call back if the way was clear. KRES.GRA. She whispered, her primitive language carrying meanings that transcended words. Trust me. Be brave. We will be together again. The juvenile nodded with a solemnity that spoke to intelligence beyond its years. It had seen death in the caves below, had felt the terror of the flood, had learned that the world was a place where safety was nothing more than a temporary illusion. But it had also learned that family meant everything, that some bonds were stronger than stone. The ascent through the crack was a nightmare of scraped skin and bruised bones. The limestone walls pressed in from all sides, sometimes so narrow that they had to exhale completely just to squeeze through. But inch by painful inch, they climbed toward the light above. The first juvenile reached the surface and called back with a sound of pure joy. The call echoed down the narrow passage, carrying with it the promise that the nightmare was finally over. One by one, they emerged from their stone prison into the clean morning air. The world above was transformed. The storm had washed the savannah clean, leaving everything green and fresh and impossibly alive. Water pooled in every depression, creating mirrors that reflected the pale blue sky. The air was sweet with the scent of rain-washed grass and blooming acacia trees. But it was the silence that struck her most profoundly. After the howling of wolves and the roar of underground rivers, the gentle whisper of wind through grass seemed like the most beautiful music ever created. They were alive. They were free. They were home. The female stood on shaking legs, her body a map of cuts and bruises that would heal in time. The juveniles pressed close to her, seeking comfort in her presence, even though she had no more to give than they did. They were all changed by what they had endured, marked by violence and loss in ways that would never fully fade. In the distance, smoke still rose from the fire that had guided them to freedom. It came from another group of their kind, she realized, a larger family that had weathered the storm in safety. They would be welcomed there, she knew. In this harsh world, survivors always found room for other survivors. As they walked across the rain-soaked savanna toward that distant smoke, she felt something stirring in her primitive consciousness. It was more than relief, more than simple gratitude for survival. It was the recognition that they had crossed some invisible threshold, had become something more than they were before. In the caves below, facing death with nothing but sharp stones and desperate courage, she had discovered something that would echo through the ages. It was the knowledge that intelligence and determination could triumph over raw strength, that the small could defeat the large if they were clever enough and brave enough to try. Her descendants would call it many things: courage, ingenuity, the human spirit. But in that moment, as the morning sun warmed her battered body and the juveniles ran ahead through the wet grass, she simply knew it as the difference between surviving and living. Behind them, the entrance to the cave system was barely visible, just another crack in the limestone hills that dotted the landscape. The wolves were gone, either drowned in the flood or trapped forever in the stone passages below. The alpha's blood had long since been washed away by the underground river, leaving no trace of the battle that had raged in the darkness. But the change it had wrought could not be erased. In facing impossible odds and refusing to surrender, she had taken the first step on a journey that would lead her kind from the caves of Africa to the stars themselves. The smoke ahead grew larger, and with it came the sounds of her people, the guttural calls and primitive songs that would one day become language, literature, and music. They were not just surviving anymore. They were becoming. As she walked toward her future, a small part of her primitive mind wondered what other challenges lay ahead, what other impossible odds her kind would face in the long journey toward whatever destiny awaited them. But those were thoughts for another day. Today, it was enough to be alive under the African sun, to feel the warm grass beneath her feet, and to know that sometimes, when everything seems lost, courage and love are enough to light the way home. The female Homo habilis and her family disappeared into the shimmering heat haze of the savanna, their footprints joining the countless others that marked the slow but inevitable march of evolution. They had faced the darkness and emerged into the light, carrying with them the spark that would one day ignite human civilization itself. But that ... is a story for another time.